Melissa is the principal of MC Consulting and founder of the Pocket Lobbyist, an innovative, subscription-based public policy tool. She has worked for the government of Alberta as a staffer and a bureaucrat, at a global law firm as a policy analyst, and as a senior executive at 2 national public relations firms. The nonprofit vote is pleased to have engaged with Melissa to provide today's analysis of the budget from a nonprofit lens. And over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here today. I know that during this time, there are endless sort of places that you can go for this kind of information. And so the fact that you've come to this presentation and to CCVO and the nonprofit vote for welcoming Pocket Lobbyist to provide some of our insights, we're very grateful for it, and we're really excited for the opportunity. Now, I know we only have about 20 minutes, so we will get right to it. For those of you who don't know, Pocket Lobbyist is a subscription-based platform for organizations to help empower those who may not have a full budget for a lobbyist or who want to complement their lobbying services. We have briefing notes, trackers, political documents, anything that we would develop in the course of working in the government relations and lobbying space that you can access online as a member from our portal. We also have a free newsletter as well as cohort programs that teach folks how to lobby and be effective with the government. And so we're really grateful to be here today as well. We don't have a ton of time to dive into all of the different specifics of every different line item in budget. So today our goal here is to make sure we cover some of the key themes, the numbers. We've broken down some of the key sectors that are going to be relevant for many in this group. And then we'll talk a bit about what it means and how you can take some of these insights and some of the analysis that you'll hear today and actually apply it within your organization, because action is always a welcome thing when we're talking about government relations and lobbying. As the folks said, the deck will be available after, so if you want to focus any more on any of the slides, you're more than welcome to do that following. So themes for budget 2024. As you all know, budget was tabled last week. There's our finance minister, Minister Horner, and Premier Smith. It was titled A Responsible Plan for a Growing Province. Now, every budget is as much a required operational document as it is a political document, and every budget tells a story. And this budget is really about meeting the growing population challenges for this province while maintaining healthcare and education spending. Now, when we look at some of the 2 priorities that the government invested in, you see that boosting Alberta's advantage, so investments in strategic industries, in maintaining Alberta's low tax environment, and others that make Alberta an attractive place to be was priority 1, as well as I said, those investments in healthcare and education, investing in a growing population of Albertans. Now, we'll get into some of the specifics. Even though healthcare and education did both see increases, it would be fair to say we did not see massive increases across government, and we can talk about that a bit more. But this will provide you here with some context on some of the reasons why. So last year in budget 2023, when Minister Taves was still the finance minister, the government introduced a fiscal framework which mandates that they must have balanced budgets. They must limit year-over-year operating increases to population growth and inflation, and in-year expenses to have voted on contingency. And any surplus cash must be allocated to either the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, to the Alberta Fund, or to debt repayment. So the government really did narrow its ability to spend with this legislation that they introduced, and that will inform some of the decisions that they made in this budget. Now, if we look at the numbers, we always like to give a bit of a sense. Sometimes budget documents are a bit confusing because there's so many different numbers, and because they're political documents, those numbers can be used to communicate different stories, depending on what the message that you want to communicate is. So the way that we've laid out some of these numbers and the key economic indicators, we're showing you on the top row the forecast. So that is what is projected to ultimately have been the numbers after the end of this current fiscal year is completed, which will be at the end of this March. And then you see at the bottom in the 24-25 estimates, that is what is effectively budget 2024. That's what the government has projected beginning April 1st of this year, going all the way to next year to March 31st. And so I know that's sometimes confusing, and we want to just make sure we're clear about it. as you can see, revenue is down and operating expense are up when we compare from last year. Part of the reason why, and we'll get into more of the specifics on revenue, is lower resource revenue. There's volatility in oil price revenues, as well as increased costs because of Alberta's growing population growth. You also see an increase in capital grants. So that's money that was allocated for this fiscal year's capital envelope. And you see a lower contingency fund, which usually goes towards supporting disaster relief and unexpected costs that might come up throughout the year. You see as well that $5.2 billion surplus that we thought we were getting perhaps in the mid-year fiscal update in November is actually only $367 million. And a further point on that is that this is an accounting surplus, and the government will actually have to borrow an additional $2.4 billion in 24-25, or could perhaps borrow another $2.4 billion in 24-25. So there's still, the financial situation is still not as good as we had projected. And then we also see that taxpayer supported debt is going up as well, though down significantly since the government made a pretty big $13.2 billion investment last year and allocated some money from surplus this year as well. Economic assumptions are important. They've always been important in Alberta as we're on this sort of resource revenue roller coaster, as some call it, but it's also even more important now because spending increases due to the fiscal framework are deeply tied to population growth and CPI, which is inflation. So you see that that the population growth last year in 23-24 at 4.1%, massive increases in population growth. Still going to be lots of population growth this year, but not as much as last year. And we also see that inflation will hopefully come down as well. Now we see employment, the unemployment rate is going to be up, and real GDP growth is up, and our net debt to GDP is down as well. So these are some of the things that government is looking at when they wonder if they can spend more or less, and how to make some of those really decisions that they need to make with scarce or limited resources. Oil is an important metric for Alberta's revenue and ability to spend. So it's projected to be down this year, though the differential is also down, which should be good for Alberta as well. So those are some of those key energy assumptions that you can consider in the context of budget. Now, when we look at revenue, we've tried to break it down here to show you the different sources of revenue. We see that revenue is down this year. There's a lower amount of corporate income tax being collected this year. And then as well, resource revenue is also down. So that is the source of some of the lower revenues. They really did not increase taxes very much anywhere else. We see an electric vehicle tax, but we didn't see any other big shifts in terms of the revenue sources. It really is just that resource delta that Alberta continues to deal with. Now, this is a chart that shows the difference between the resource revenue that Alberta has collected over the last several years and the other revenues. And so you can definitely see that as resource revenue varies, so too does the amount that the province is spending. But you do see that the trend is definitely upward in terms of revenue that they're bringing in, which is a good sign for the province. When we look at spending, we see that operational spending increases were primarily focused on health and education, which I think is welcome for many. But obviously, we're going to talk about the challenges inherent for the rest of the nonprofit and social services sector, because there are many other organizations that don't fall into that health and education bucket that are also facing the challenges and increases for population growth as well. But you can see that the single biggest amount of spending in the budget is health, closely followed by education, which is education and advanced education, and social services. So those are the top three spends of the provincial budget. And you see that spending is up as well, though not to inflation and population growth, more to that 3.9% mark. You also see, this is not explicitly included in budget. We did our own calculations on this as best as we could, but you also just see the division of capital plan envelope for this year. So you see there are significant infrastructure investments going into Calgary, partly due to some of the investments that you see at U of C and the arena, with provincial investments that sort of benefit Albertans across the province, and then Edmonton and rural investments, not to the same extent that we see those Calgary investments as well. But this is for just this year's envelope. So to do a more broader analysis, you'd look at all 3 years of the envelope, but that's for this year. When we see as well how the government is trending in expenses, so what they're spending, you see that operational makes up the majority of the budget, as well as capital. And you do see that government continues to spend more each year, though perhaps not as much as all organizations would like to see, but you do see that trend is definitely upward. I do want to touch on the Heritage Savings Trust Fund before we sort of dive into some of these other topics here. Part of the reason why the government introduced their fiscal framework and why they've made investments into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund is to try to get off the so-called resource revenue roller coaster by reinvesting in this fund. And so you see that they have made some significant investments this year, about $3.2 billion this year. They want to grow this fund to somewhere between $250 and $400 billion by 2050, which means that we will continue to see sizable deposits into this fund until it's built up more and until the debt is paid off as well. When we look at debt, you know, there's over the past several years, there's been a lot of different schools of thought on whether government debt is good or bad, and we won't get into talking about that too much, but this just sort of shows you the way in which debt has increased in the province and the way that those debt servicing costs have also increased in the province, especially with rising interest rates. And so this is something, the reason why this is relevant for today's conversation is that the government looks at these charts, this particular government at least, and doesn't like what they see. And so they have definitely prioritized debt repayment because they want to see those numbers continue to come down so that costs associated with debt servicing can be reallocated to program spend. When we also look at net debt to GDP across of Canada, you see that debt has increased across Canada significantly in the past several years. We're now at about a combined federal provincial debt of about $2.2 trillion. And you see this as something as well that the government looks at within the context of being in Alberta, which definitely is in the best position amongst all provinces, and they want to definitely address this as well. But it's difficult to address all of those things as well as meet the needs of population growth. Now, Alberta saw incredibly high population growth. The government's Alberta is Calling campaign is clearly working in many ways. We expect that the province is going to increase to about 5 million people by 2026, which is significant for this group because many of you are serving many of those Albertans and providing the supports that they need when they come here if they need them when they come here. But you do see that the biggest source of population growth is international. And you can kind of see that some of the interprovincial growth as well, most number of people coming from Ontario and BC, but many as 40,000 coming internationally as well. And many of those folks are needing support within the community as they come, if they're coming from Ukraine or other places as well. Now, I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to get into some of the context and nuance on budget. And so this is, you know, we're at Pocket Lobbyist, we're a nonpartisan source of information. And so we don't necessarily say that you should like the reasons why governments made decisions that they have, but understanding why they've made those decisions is definitely relevant for you within your own organization. So the government is looking at geopolitical uncertainty, which has a huge effect on oil price. They're looking at several different federal government policies that have increased costs on Alberta. Cost of living with inflation is high for everybody. They're looking at the cost of borrowing, which has increased with rising interest rates, and the costs associated with population growth, as well as climate change, droughts, floods, all of these extreme weather events that we've seen increase over the last several years. So when they are looking at some of this, it does affect, whether they followed through on some of their promises when they're looking at their sort of fiscal plan. So we do see some of the promises that the government made in the election campaign come through. You see the Community and Recreation Center Infrastructure Program, which will support municipalities to provide community facilities. The seniors discount is in, as well as some other industrial projects as well. Some new things for this group to be aware of. The government definitely did come through on some sort of economic programs, but they've also introduced an electric vehicle tax, which is expected to bring in about $1 million. It'll be $200 a vehicle for starting as early as January 2025. Some of the things we are noticeably absent in budget, we do not see that new tax bracket that was promised during the campaign for under $60,000. It's being delayed until at least next year, only fully being implemented in 26-27. We do not see any new affordability measures. The government spent almost $200 million last budget. And we see the fuel tax back as well. So no direct affordability measures in this budget. We also don't see any funding for the South Edmonton Hospital, and no mention of the Alberta pension plan as well. So when we look at the path that the government is after in the next several days and weeks, you can kind of see the process that they have to go through, the estimates process right now. And then we'll see the mid-year fiscal update in November as well. Now, to get into, I know we only have a couple of minutes, so to just get into some of the details for the sector, we know that a lot of folks in this sector are facing significant pressures. You have increased costs with inflationary pressures, as well as increased demand with that population growth, and Albertans who are struggling to make ends meet. You see that as far as the spend goes, when we look at the sort of sectoral spend, this is the top 5 ministries that the government is spending money on. And you see that it's about $56 billion towards those 5 ministries, with all of those other ministries, many of whom are very important to folks in this group, being sort of left with whatever's left. And so you definitely do not see the widespread increases in those remaining 21 that you do for those top 5. We do see some general supports, though, relevant for this group. So no cuts really to budgets that fund FCSS and civil societies, but no increases either, which some may consider a cut in the context of population growth. You also see for health, at least, you see some pretty big investments in physician compensation to accommodate for population growth. You see that they're in the process of undergoing their refocusing healthcare rollout, which will create the new 4 primary organizations for healthcare delivery. As well, they are investing $88 million for integrated health and social infrastructure planning, which Minister Horner has stated is an effort to make sure that more of the infrastructure spend when it comes to health and social infrastructure follows more of a formulaic approach, much like it is included in education on a go-forward basis as well. For education, you do see $1.9 billion for newer modernized schools, and then short-term $1.103 million to fill the need. You also don't see the education property tax unfrozen, though the fact that there is more population growth in Alberta, they do expect that to go up as well. And then you do see some training spots at PSIs open up for in-demand jobs as well. Housing is probably the one area outside of education and health that the government has made significant investments in. So you see several of these announcements have already been made, and it's a big focus for them in the seniors community social services sector. You also see some pretty significant arts and culture funding for Calgary, at least, and then some increases as well for Alberta Foundation of the Arts too. When we look at workforce planning, one of the things, there's been some changes in terms of ministerial service delivery. You now see childcare strategy in actually jobs economy and innovation, or jobs economy trade. And so you see that there's $1.4 billion in that budget to execute on that $15 a day daycare, as well as those grants to try and attract people in high demand jobs to come to Alberta to serve all of the new population growth we've seen, as well as $85 million for both prevention of family and sexual violence, which affects primarily women's shelters and sexual assault centers. Now I'm going to try and wrap this up in the next minute because I know that I'm super close to being done, and we can probably get into a lot of the discussion in the panel. But if I had sort of 4 things to advise to this group, I would just say that, again, it doesn't mean that we like this information, but just in terms of what we're seeing, we're definitely seeing a new normal in terms of what organizations can expect in terms of government funding. Surpluses are not necessarily going to mean an abundance of extra cash as they try to get their fiscal situation in order. So you're going to see measured increases, which does not mean that you're going to see increases to CPI, inflation, and population growth. The government, I think, views this as a ceiling, not a floor. So I know that that's going to be a big source of disappointment for a lot of organizations that thought that the spending increase should be around 6% or so, but the minister has said it is a ceiling, not a floor. As well, in this environment, being able to leverage with your sector colleagues as well as private donors is going to be extraordinarily important. I've noticed that the government really does value that sort of coming to them as after you've had sort of proof of concept, if you're able to in certain situations, or showing that you're soliciting private support as well. Again, doesn't mean that we like this reality, but just in terms of things that you can do as well. And Budget 2025 starts now. So if you did not get something that you wanted, or you want to see things differently, you need to make sure you get your capital asks in the next couple of months and operational asks in by the fall. And then, of course, my favorite GR tip, say what you mean, but don't say it mean. Getting into an argument with the government in year 1 of their term has never, in my experience, yielded anything positive, even if it's very well intentioned and even justified. So just in terms of your own dealings with government, definitely try to be partners, explain, share, and develop versus being adversarial. And so I know I'm a few minutes over, but that's my information there. And for Pocket Lobbyist, and I know Alexa will be sharing the deck as well as a discount for everybody who is on the call should they be interested in trying out our services. So thanks so much, and sorry for being late.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I would say, please don't apologize for being late. This is why we're here. This is exactly what we came for. So thank you so much. Glad that you referenced again that this presentation is going to be made available after the session is over, and you'll find it on the nonprofitvote.ca.